Hello there and welcome to History Class. In this video I'm going to be looking at 5 occasions in modern history in which Germany, you could argue, was the centre of the world both politically and geographically. Yes, welcome back, Richie here again, thank you for joining us. And in this video, as I say, we're looking at 5 moments in history when Germany was, if you ask me, was the centre of the world both politically and geographically. We're looking at those events over modern history in more detail, and also at the end of the video I'm going to be asking the question whether Germany still holds that position as the centre of the world. Is it still this political centre, this geographical centre, as the new world political order takes shape? Our starting point then is 1945, and we are approaching the end of World War II. 1945 was of course the final year of World War II. Having been the lead aggressor in the war, the German Third Reich was the political and geographical centre of the world, split into two. On the one side were the Allies of World War II. They would later be referred to as the United Nations, incidentally, following the declaration of the 1st of January 1942. And on the other side we had the Axis powers. The Allies promoted the alliance as a means to control the German, Japanese and Italian aggression. At the start of the war then, on the 1st of September in 1939, the Allies consisted of France, Poland and the United Kingdom, as well as their dependent states such as British India, for example. A few days later, and these allies were already joined by the independent dominions of the British Commonwealth, so Australia, Canada, New Zealand and South Africa. And after the start of the German invasion of North Europe and until the end of the Balkan campaign, the start of the Balkan campaign, the Netherlands, Belgium, Greece and Yugoslavia also joined the Allies. The Soviet Union joined the Allies in June 1941 after being invaded by Germany. The United States had continually provided material, war material and finance to the Allies, but eventually joined in 1941 after the December 1941 after the invasion of the bombing of Pearl Harbor. China had been in a prolonged war with Japan since the Marco Polo Bridge event in 1937, but didn't join the Allies until 1941. At this stage, of course, there is less of an argument that Germany is the centre of a geographical divide in the world, as the territories, the Allies on one side and the Axis powers on the other side, are spread out throughout Europe and the world. But this is very much a political divide. You can say roughly on the one side you have the fascist powers and on the other side the non-fascist powers, because on the non-fascist powers on the Allies side, as time would tell, there are some very different political persuasions within that group. So at the moment it's non-fascists against the fascists, Allies against the Axis powers. So it was clear that the end of the war was going to mark a massive change in the balance of power and in this world political map. Developments and change in Italy probably are the best microcosm example that reflect this change and how this massive change was going to affect the world. The country, of course, had been a major member of the Axis powers, but after multiple military losses and the surrendering of all of Italy's colonies to the advancing armed forces, Allied forces, Benito Mussolini was deposed in July 1943 by order of King Victor Emmanuel III. That was in cooperation with the members of the Grand Council of Fascism at the time. Victor Emmanuel III subsequently dismantled the remaining apparatus of the fascist regime and appointed Field Marshal Pietro Badoglio as Prime Minister of Italy. It was the beginning of the end of fascism in Italy and essentially the beginning of the end of fascism in Europe. Only Spain remained after World War II as under fascist dictatorial rule, and that lasted until 1976 when Spain voted yes to a first democratic constitution since the Second Republic following the Civil War and the military coup of Francisco Franco in the 1930s, of course. He died in 1975 and Spain proved to be the last fascist state, surviving fascist state in Europe after the war. If the political balance had previously been between fascist and anti-fascist regimes, it was clear that the future would have to have two very different poles, with the disappearance of the fascist states in Europe. But even then, Germany was destined to be the centre of that new world, and this time Germany would take on an even more clear geographical centre of the world as a symbol of this new divide. And we have to fast forward to 1949. 1949, of course, is the year that marked the founding of the the two new German states, the Federal Republic of Germany on the one side and the German Democratic Republic on the other. The Federal Republic of Germany was formally established as a separate and independent nation on May the 23rd, 1949. This effectively ended any discussion of reunifying East and West Germany. The Soviets reacted quickly to the action in West Germany, and in October of 1949, the German Democratic Republic, or East Germany as was known, was officially announced. This, of course, drew to a close a 4-year period after World War II, in which Germany was divided into 4 occupation zones, with the British, French, Americans and Soviets all controlling one zone. The city of Berlin, as the capital, was also divided in a similar manner, with the territories of West Berlin later to become some kind of weird island floating in the middle of the East German state. This arrangement was intended to be temporary, but differences between the communist and non-communist occupying nations became more and more apparent and ultimately brought about the Cold War, which would define the world and define Germany at its centre for 40 years to follow. In May 1946, the United States had halted reparation payments from West Germany to the Soviet Union. In December, the United States and Great Britain combined their occupation zones in what came to be known as the Bisonia, with France agreeing to join the agreement later on, leading to the combination of the zones to form one single zone in May 1949. On May the 23rd, the West German Parliamentary Council met to formally announce the establishment of the Federal Republic of Germany. Konrad Adenauer, the president of the council and the future chancellor, first chancellor of West Germany of course, proudly proclaimed, "Today a new Germany arises." But it was a somber occasion, many of the German representatives still harbouring hope that Germany might be reunified. 2 communist members of the council refused to sign the proclamation establishing the new state, in fact. As a response to the foundation of the new Federal Republic of Germany, the West German state in Bonn, in October 1949, the USSR encouraged the proclamation of the German Democratic Republic in Berlin. East Berlin became the capital of the GDR. Western states refused initially to recognise this state, which, following the example of the FRG, presumed to speak for all of Germany. Communist Wilhelm Pieck became the president of the German Democratic Republic, and Otto Grotewohl, a former socialist democrat, was made the head of government. But it was Walter Ulbricht, leader of the Communist Party, who would subsequently become the most significant politician in this early period of the GDR. In 1946, the Social Democratic Party in the Soviet zone had merged with the Communist Party, the KPD, to form the Socialist Union Party, or the SED. This party would ultimately be led by communists and become the one single ruling party until the end of the communist era in 1989, in East Germany of course. Ulbricht oversaw the construction of the GDR as a socialist state in this early period until his removal from power in 1971. For the next 41 years, East and West Germany were the symbols of a divided world. The Cold War animosities between the Soviet Union and the United States were the result of the new political divide, and after the USA's use of the atomic bomb in Japan at the end of World War II, the threat of nuclear war was, for many of us that grew up in that period, a real one, or at least it felt like a real one. The world once again was divided largely into 2 ideological poles. It was no longer the fascists against the rest. In Europe it was the East against West, and communism against the states of the free market economy. This time the political map had a clear physical border. It ran clearly between Mecklenburg, Western Pomerania and Schleswig-Holstein, Saxony-Anhalt and Lower Saxony, Thuringia and Lower Saxony and Hesse and Bavaria, and Saxony and Bavaria, and through the centre of Berlin of course. So at this point in 1949, not only is there a clearly established new political order to the world, but also a clear dividing line, a clear border which runs straight through the middle of Germany. Germany is still, or once again, the political and geographical centre of the world. We move on swiftly now to our third moment in history, and to 1961, and of course the building of the Berlin Wall. By 1961 the leadership of the SED was under pressure. Around 2.7 million people had left the GDR and East Berlin between 1949 and 1961. Around half of this steady stream of refugees were young people under the age of 25. Roughly 500,000 people crossed the border across the sector borders in Berlin each day in both directions, enabling them to compare living conditions on both sides. In 1960 alone, around 200,000 people made a permanent move to the west. The GDR, as a result, was facing social and economic difficulties. Despite Walter Ulbricht as late as the 15th of 1961 claiming that there were absolutely no plans to build the wall, on the 12th of August 1961, the GDR Council of Ministers finally announced what it called border controls of the kind generally found in every sovereign state will be set up on the border of the German Democratic Republic, including the border to the western sectors of Greater Berlin. Billed as an anti-fascist protective wall by the GDR, it would ultimately only restrict the movement of its own citizens, who would no longer be permitted to cross the border themselves, whereas those in the west would still be allowed to enter East Berlin. Temporary barriers were first installed at the border, separating the Soviet sector from West Berlin in the early hours of the 13th of August 1961. Cobblestones and asphalt of the connecting roads were also ripped up. Over the next few days and weeks, the barbed wire along the border was to be replaced by a wall of concrete slabs and hollow blocks. It was built by East Berlin construction workers, monitored up closely by border guards. In the matter of just one day, the wall separated streets, squares and neighbourhoods from each other and severed public transport links. On the evening of August the 13th, Governing Mayor Willy Brandt said in a speech to the House of Representatives, "The Berlin Senate publicly condemns the illegal and inhuman measures being taken by those who are dividing Germany, oppressing East Berlin and threatening West Berlin." On the 25th of October 1961, there was even a standoff between American and Soviet tanks at the Friedrichstraße border crossing used by foreign nationals, what is known as Checkpoint Charlie. East German officials had begun to deny US diplomats the unhindered access to East Berlin, although this was part of an agreement with Moscow on post-war occupation. Then, on the 22nd of October, E. Allen Leitner Jr., the senior US diplomat in West Berlin, was stopped by East German border guards on his way to the State Opera House in East Berlin. The East Germans demanded to see his passport, but he insisted that only Soviet officials had the right to ask for his identification documentation. Leitner, in that case, was forced to turn back. General Clay, who had been sent by Washington following the erection of the Berlin Wall, ordered that the next American diplomat entering East Berlin would have to be escorted by the US Army military police in jeeps. The maneuver was successful this first time, but East Germans continued to assert their claim to control Western Allied officials entering Berlin. Clay then ordered American M48 tanks to head to Checkpoint Charlie. They stood just 75 meters from the border, prompting Nikita Khrushchev to send an equal amount of Russian T-55 tanks to face down the Americans. They also took up positions around 75 meters from the east/west Berlin border, and the tanks remained there for around 16 hours. Eventually the somewhat farcical confrontation ended as tanks were withdrawn one by one. Clay was under pressure from Kennedy to defuse the situation. Then, in return for Kennedy's assurance that the West had no intention of taking East Berlin, the Soviet leader recognized the Allied officials and military personnel that recognized that they would have impeded access to the East German capital. So just like the four-power status of Berlin didn't change that day, the balance of power wasn't altered by the building of the Berlin Wall. It was rather just underlined. The border established in 1949 and the world's new division received its own physical landmark, and Germany's geographical position at the center of the world was given a new physical form, the symbol that would dominate Berlin for many years, the Berlin Wall. Let's fast forward to 40 years after the founding of the two separate German states to 1989. I of course now have just two more dates for you, both of which seem to draw this period of Cold War and the division of Germany to an end, at least superficially. On the 11th of September 1989, Hungary opened its border to Austria. This was the beginning of the end of the Soviet Union, the socialist bloc of states, after the period of rule overseen by Gorbachev from 1985 to 1991. Gorbachev was a reformer with big plans for the Soviet Union. He introduced the policies of glasnost, which literally translated means openness, and allowed for enhanced freedom of speech and press. This was accompanied by his program of perestroika, which literally translated means restructuring, as he sought to decentralize economic decision making to improve efficiency. It was a bold plan to break with an oppressive past. Ultimately, it would prove to be the end of the Soviet bloc. Just 2 months later, after the opening of the Hungarian border, the Berlin Wall was opened on the 9th of November 1989. Initially, this was due to a misunderstanding in German Democratic Republic's bureaucracy, but within 4 days, 4 million GDR citizens had crossed the border with their ID, each of them receiving 100 German marks as what was known as Begrüßungsgeld, welcome money, as they were allowed to visit West Berlin. Our final date is 1990, which saw the completion of reunification of Germany, or maybe we should say the unification of a new Germany. Following the opening of the borders, many East Germans had fled, and they also followed what was known as the Peaceful Revolution. On the 8th of February 1990, the Stasi was disbanded, making way for the first free elections in the GDR on the 18th of March 1990. There then also followed negotiations between the GDR and the FRG that culminated in the Unification Treaty. Other negotiations between the German Democratic Republic and the Federal Republic of Germany and the 4 occupying powers produced the so-called 2+4 Treaty, the treaty on the final settlement with respect to Germany. This granted full sovereignty to a unified German state, the 2 parts of which had still been bound by limitations stemming from the post-World War II status as occupied regions. The United Germany is not a successor state, but rather an enlarged continuation of the former West Germany. It is the original Federal Republic of Germany plus the annexed territories of the former GDR, and it retains the West German seats in international organizations, including the Euro, for example. So what does this all mean for Germany's position as the center of the world politically and geographically in today's world? On the one hand, the disappearance of the Soviet Union, the Eastern Bloc, as the counterpole to the West and the USA, their adoption of free market capitalism initially left a void. The Cold War made for much animosity and suspicion on the world stage, but it gave us some kind of certainty and balance of structure for 40 years. You could argue that Germany no longer is the center of this world. The East-West divide has crumbled like its symbol, the Berlin Wall. There is a new divide developing in the world. Conflicts are focused on the Middle East these days. The modern narrative is of the West against Islamic radicalism. The new worldwide boogeyman is that used to be red communism is now this perceived Muslim terrorist, a cold war between the West and Muslim terrorists. But what has really changed? Well, relations between the West and Russia continue to be strained. The Federation may have embraced market capitalism, but so has communist China for that matter. And Russia seems to have just as many problems with a democratic deficit as the former Soviet Union. Since the end of World War II and even during the Cold War, there has always been this abundance of conflicts carried out in the Middle East as both sides fought for influence in what are essentially oil-rich territories. We still fight wars and spend horrendous amounts on our defense budgets, but we don't fight our wars. The only difference today is we don't fight our wars on European territory or US soil. We do it in the Middle East. Maybe it's only really the narrative in the press that's different. It's no longer the Americans against the red commie, it's the Americans against the radical Muslim. Germany also remains a very important military strategic base for the US Army due to its proximity to the Middle East, and I would urge anybody not to be misled by a headline saying that Trump is withdrawing troops from Germany. Despite the possible relevance of this whole dispute, Trump being disgruntled about the building of pipelines from Russia to Germany to transport natural gas and the Western European dependence on Russia as an energy supplier. Ramstein continues to be the main US military base here in Europe and the site from where all the drone strikes are controlled. All the drone strikes on the Middle East are carried out from Ramstein in Rhineland-Palatinate in Germany. So to conclude then, maybe Germany continues to be the unfortunate centre of the world when it comes to conflict and war. 70 years of peace in Europe, a perceivably different political map. There is no Cold War anymore, but Germany is still the strategic base for military options and the centre of continued conflicts between the US and Russia. As ever, I would love to hear your opinions on this matter. Maybe you have something to add to the debate, your own personal opinion. Feel free to comment down below. whatever, I think it's a really fascinating place to live. The history of Germany, of course, the modern history of Germany is fascinating, and Germany seems to always be a very important player on the world stage, and it takes on a very important geographical location and location on the political map of the world. I hope this video was interesting for you. Thank you very much for watching. If you did enjoy it, please do like and subscribe, and if you want to help me, support me further, help me keep making content like this, pop over to Patreon, check out my Patreon account. You can support me there and sign up for the monthly Q&A. Otherwise, I will see you here in the next video here on YouTube. Thank you very much again for watching. See you next time.